Welcome to the League of Women Voters of Snohomish County Forum for candidates for Representative Position 2 for Legislative District 38. I'm your moderator, Karen Madsen. I'm a member of the League of Women Voters of Snohomish County. And joining me tonight are candidates for the Representative Position 2, Ledge District 38. The candidates are Mary Fosse, David Wiley, Mark James, and Christopher Elliott. As always, the League has invited all candidates. Mark James is not joining us today. The League thanks all the candidates for running for office, for their willingness to serve the community if elected, and for participating in this forum. It is the policy of the League to be nonpartisan. Therefore, we don't endorse or oppose candidates or parties. We do take positions on issues which we've studied and upon which we've reached consensus. Ground rules for this forum were sent out ahead of time to all the candidates, and they've agreed to abide by the stated rules of decorum and will refrain from interrupting, personal attacks, or disruptive behavior. These rules will be strictly enforced. Let's talk for a moment about the question and answer period rules. Questions have not been shared with the candidates. We thank all those who sent us recommendations for questions about local issues. I will pose the questions. Each candidate will have 90 seconds to respond. Less or more time might be allowed for selected questions. If there's a change in the time allowed for a question, I'll state this change clearly. We're using a countdown timer visible to all the candidates. It shows elapsed time and alerts the candidate when there are 15 seconds left and when time is up. Time limits on answers will be strictly enforced. When you see the timer turn red and hear the chime, you're out of time. I'll change the starting order for each question, rotating through all the candidates to ensure a random and fair sequence. And the order for the first question will be Mr. Elliott, followed by Mr. Wiley, followed by Ms. Fosse. On the second question, Mr. Wiley will lead off, followed by Ms. Fosse and Mr. Elliott, and so on through the questions. And the first question goes to Mr. Elliott. Mr. Elliott, what qualifications and experience make you a strong candidate for this position?
I've worked in the community of Everett and Snohomish County for the past 10 years. I've worked in group homes, I've worked in community settings, I've worked in the school district, the Everett School District. I've been on the Everett Diversity Advisory Board for several terms. I was on the Everett Envision Everett Committee a few years back. And I've worked in the prison nearby, so I've gotten a chance to meet people from all walks of life, all different age groups, all different experiences. And during this whole time, I've played a role primarily of mental health therapist, so I've gotten to really hear things that people are going through, again, at all levels. And I've gotten to hear their concerns and things that they want to be better and things that they want to be different, whether it's personal, political, financial, whatever it is. And I feel like I also have a really good ability to work with anybody on any matter and come to what ideally would be the best solution, or at least a good stepping point if we can't quite reach the best solution during that time. Other than that, I love it. I love the city. I love the surrounding area, and I think it's a great place. So thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Wiley?
Yeah, there's what makes someone qualified to be a representative. I have an educational background as a biologist. I've worked as a quality assurance engineer for many years. I've been active in politics also for many years. But I don't think any of those things are really what makes a person the most qualified for being a state representative. What makes a person most qualified is not something that easily fits on a resume, and that is listening to your constituents. How involved will you be in your community? And especially for, not just listening to those with money or those that have a loud majority voice, but listening to everyone, including the poor and the minorities and all the other groups. Because as a representative, you need to be able to represent everyone, including those who don't agree with you or align with your own perspective. And I believe that I am well suited to do that.
Thank you, Mr. Wiley. Ms. Fosse?
Could you please repeat questions if possible? That would be helpful for me. You're on mute, Erin.
Thank you so much. What qualifications and experience make you a strong candidate for this position?
Thanks. Yeah. So my name is Mary Fosse. I currently serve on the Everett City Council, and I am formerly had been working in the legislature full time. I live in Everett, mother of two, former union member, as was my husband, who's also a veteran. Also serve on the Regional Law and Justice Council and the Puget Sound Regional Council Growth Management Policy Board, and the Everett Public Schools Fiscal Advisory Council. Past work as an operations manager, employment specialist, an executive assistant, event coordinator, and a small business owner in Everett for the last decade. Aside from council, my work on the Everett Districting Commission, most people actually know me as a dedicated community advocate and volunteer because I've been really involved. I'm running for state rep because with Mike Sell's departure, we really will need champions in Olympia for the needs of workers in the state. And what really makes me a good advocate and the right candidate is that beyond having all of this experience in the legislature and the ability to run effective campaigns, I have the perspective of what it is to struggle. I was born into low-income housing to a single mom, and I've been homeless as a child, and I'm a survivor, and I understand the barriers people face when dealing with trauma and coming from disadvantaged backgrounds. And we overcame poverty, and that's really what I want as opportunities for my neighbors to have a safe home and a job and a better quality of life. And that, I think, gives me a greater perspective, which is valuable in this role.
Thank you. Mr. Wiley, you'll lead off on this next question. What are 2 or 3 major issues that need to be addressed by the legislature?
Thank you very much. Well, my top 3 priorities that I find that most people agree with me that need to be addressed is number 1 is justice reform. We have an epidemic of crime in our area, and we have a lot of system, but not very much justice in our justice system. As far as recent events that a shooter at a local high school was quickly let out on a $250 bail, while other people are fleeced down and feel that the court goes after them for money. And really need to shift the focus to create accountability and have a system that is focused on protecting the public. Second is protecting the economy. The last 2 years have been really rough for the Washington state economy. And with global events going on, it's going to get a lot worse. And I know the instinct in Olympia is to squeeze people for more taxes, but we really need to bring the economy up now, and we need to bring it up fast, because one of the best ways actually to fund the government isn't to squeeze people for more, but to raise the economy, as a rising tide raises all boats. And the other thing that we really have to address right now is the housing crisis. The homelessness, families being forced into poverty, paying everything for rent, and just everything being out of control. And that's my time.
Thank you, Mr. Wiley. Ms. Fosse, 2 or 3 major issues?
Thank you. Well, I love living here, but there are definitely some major issues that our legislature needs to address. And many of these issues are actually intersectional. So we're going to be needing to look at more comprehensive approaches. I want to advocate for this community, so that includes tackling our housing affordability and homelessness crises, and supporting our schools and social infrastructure, and more holistic approaches to our public health and safety. But we need to make sure also not to forget about supporting economic efforts that prioritize living wage jobs and our skilled workforce pipelines. So I would say number 1 is definitely clearly the homelessness and housing affordability issues. We need to address that. Housing affordability is impacting everybody right now. And we really need to work on the systemic causes of homelessness. And I have the lived experience to tackle this issue compassionately and directly. Number 2, my neighbors want safer and healthier communities. We can help everyone by making critical investments into our healthcare and support those holistic approaches to public safety that will ultimately make our community a lot safer and healthier, or more affordable in the long run.
Thank you. Mr. Elliott, your thoughts?
The first thing that I feel we need to address is actually the politics of Washington State. I think over the last several years, we've really seen the impact that people feel immediately from politics on a state level, local level, national level. And I think one of the things that keeps voter turnout low and keeps people disengaged is that politics haven't been very personable, and it's easy to put up signs and it's easy to use terms that sound nice, but how is this helping me every day? How is this hurting me every day? We've been talking about criminal justice for years and years and years, and yet we're in a spot right now where it's still a topic. So what this tells me is that things aren't being accomplished. So I don't know if that's a federal issue or a state issue, but I know it needs to change. Second, and this is an issue that I feel is central to almost everything, is the mental health system. From client reports, Washington State has had mental health care in the bottom 10 of the 50 states for over a decade. And I think this will tie into everything else. And I think the last piece is really the social justice and equality and equity that we can really revamp in our area.
Thank you. Ms. Fosse, you addressed the issue of homelessness earlier. Our next question you'll take the lead on. Please speak to ways that you would address homelessness.
Housing first policies definitely work, and we need to support partnerships and services to fill in the gaps in our social infrastructure, because it's more cost effective to prevent our neighbors from becoming homeless in the first place. I, of course, support incentivizing sustainable, mixed income, mixed use, affordable housing, especially around high transit corridors. But we need to really make sure that we're looking at all types of housing, supportive, transitional, workforce, senior housing, and so forth, and that they're all being included in our efforts. We need to do better at meeting folks at where they're at and realizing that there are as many pathways to homelessness as there should be of approaches to preventing and lifting people out of homelessness. So with more people than ever in Washington really struggling to make ends meet and living paycheck to paycheck, falling into poverty, living in their cars, we're all seeing it. And people struggling with untreated mental health issues, we need to make sure that we're prioritizing accessible pathways to living in family wage jobs and more access to wraparound services, mental health supports, he was previously talking about. I'm thrilled to witness the implementation of 988, but there's much more work to be done in this arena, especially with the lack of mental health care providers. In addition to incentivizing that workforce development and pipeline, we really need to break down the agency silos and bring in lived experience experts too.
Thank you. Mr. Elliott, your thoughts on homelessness?
Yeah, I love what Ms. Fosse said about supportive housing and the numerous pathways, because there are numerous pathways to becoming homeless. And I think there are a lot of opportunities. And again, what I'm going to stress is preventative measures. So I think that we can increase the capabilities of schools to come in, do early assessment, meet the needs of any individual who is within the district in this case, and really have kind of a task force approach to, okay, this is a child in the school, this is their family circumstance, here are the things that we can do as a district, as a state, as a community. Because working with the schools, I did work with kids who lived in their cars, or their parents had to work 3 jobs just to make ends meet. So I think that's half of it. I think the other half really is, again, like Ms. Fosse was saying, a strong economic approach. We have a wonderful array of small businesses. We also have large legacy businesses, and Everett has a strong history of being a working town. So I think if we can find a way to foster those and develop those situations more, those will naturally create some opportunities on top of, HopeWorks and GroundWorks and some of the programs that Everett and the district already has in place.
Thank you, Mr. Wiley.
Yeah, I want to say this is an issue that is personally of extreme importance to me. As recently as 2018, myself and my kids were experiencing homelessness. And it's something that I have a lot of unfortunately, firsthand experience with. Homeless people come from a lot of different backgrounds and a lot of different causes. And in the long term, we need to address each of those causes. It can be things like aging out of foster care. It can be civil court debts. But the number one issue that we have to address first with homelessness is, as the Puget Sound Research Council has identified, there's currently a shortage of 50,000 housing units in the Puget Sound area. And all the other attempts at transitional housing are going to fail until there's enough housing to actually move everybody into, and they're not doubling, tripling up on roommates and unwanted housing situations. And the reason that we have such a shortage of housing are very outdated city zoning codes that prevent the development of appropriate urban housing that we need. And I believe it's time the state steps in a little more forcefully and says, okay, Seattle, you're zoned to 80% single family housing, and it's time for that to change. It's time to become a truly urban city when you get to a certain size. And also to have more incentives for highly affordable.
Thank you, Mr. Wiley. Mr. Elliott, you'll take the lead on our next question about hospital mergers. As hospital mergers happen with greater frequency, do you have concerns about limited healthcare options in religious hospital systems? What actions, if any, would you recommend?
I think this is a systemic issue. As somebody who accepts insurance and has a 2-month waiting list to see people, I think there are a lot of things behind the scenes that we haven't even addressed yet. So when we look at things like hospital mergers, I think that's almost out of our scope at the moment. However, I think when we talk about the religious hospital settings and the religious care settings, I think things do become more complex, especially because of the diversity in our area. So this is an area, specifically when we talk about religious hospital situations, that I actually would like to hear more from the public, because I'm not as informed as I think we need to be. So I think this is a spot where we can come together as a community, highlight more of the issues so that our leaders and potential leaders have a clearer idea. That being said, I think working with community organizations, community groups, and continuing a dialogue at this time is probably best, not only because of the merger situations, but because of the social political situations as well. Thank you.
You're welcome. Mr. Wiley, your thoughts on hospital mergers?
Can you repeat the question, please?
I'd be happy to do that. As hospital mergers happen with greater frequency, do you have concerns about limited healthcare options in religious hospital systems? What actions, if any, would you recommend?
Okay. Yes, I think even without hospital mergers, there's an issue of anti-competitiveness. As far as religious aspect, I'm very protective of people's rights, and I do believe that those who are religious practitioners have the right to practice medicine as they do. The real problem is the lack of medical alternatives that many in the communities have. This comes down to what we have in Washington State that's called a Bill of Needs law, which I believe needs to be repealed. What Bill of Needs does is it prevents someone from starting up a new hospital or clinic in an area without proving to the board that there's some high level of need. And that's really inappropriate, because even while there might be a hospital in an area, they might not be adequately meeting the needs of the community. For instance, a religious hospital, and that's great, they meet the needs of their religious community, but others might be left out. So there's room for more than one, and we need to allow that. So my solution is to have competition, to have more than one provider in an area, and get rid of these anti-competitive Bill of Needs laws.
Thank you, Ms. Fosse. Would you like me to, you asked earlier if I would repeat a question. Were you asking for each question to be repeated?
I remember this one. That's all right. So as far as any concerns, I do have concerns. Next session, we're going to really need fierce advocates fighting for and protecting and expanding our reproductive rights. I support access to affordable and quality healthcare for all Washingtonians, regardless of income or sex or immigration status or other circumstance. Unfortunately, access to reproductive health care is not guaranteed for every person in Washington, and resources are still unevenly distributed. Inequities still persist in different communities, especially ones that have historically been without quality health care in the past or have had sufficient insurance coverage. So we have had a lack of regulation for medical facilities, so nearly half of all the hospital beds in the state have restrictive reproductive healthcare policies. Ideology should not interfere with a patient's access to care, and important healthcare decisions are made between you and your doctor. It's past time to put an end to discriminatory denials and unnecessary delays or burdensome processes that allow, patients to receive the actual critical care services they deserve. We also need to improve our Medicaid reimbursement rates, and reproductive rights are really just under attack across the nation. So we need leaders willing to fight for quality, accessible, equitable healthcare and reproductive freedom.
Thank you so much. Mr. Wiley, you'll take the lead on this question about education funding. How could the education funding system be adjusted to continue to improve? Let me say this again. How could the education funding system be adjusted to continue to improve equity in public school, even in the event of a local levy failure?
Yeah, so the current problem with our system is that we are funding schools and not students. We really need to have the funding chasing the students and not dumped into a school regardless of all the features there. To that end, I support unlocking the school districts, particularly in this time of COVID, where people want different levels of responses to the COVID issue, and that we also have backpack funding, that rather than the funding just being allocated to the school, that it goes to the student and follows the student, allowing them to easily transfer schools if the parents want to transport them to a different school and there's something open, or even private schools that are accredited. One of the problems that we suffer from right now in Washington are too many one-size-fits-none solutions coming out of Olympia. And I believe that parents, given the opportunity, will pick the best education system available for their children. And that we, as a state, need to enable them to do so. And we need to fund children, not schools. Fund education through children.
Ms. Fosse, your thoughts?
So I support fully funding K-12 basic education, including professional competitive compensation, benefits for educators, as well as additional mental health staff. Pandemic has really accelerated the growing kind of mental behavioral health issues and that just whole crisis in our communities. So it's had a particularly high impact on students, and it's our paramount duty to fund education. And so we need to be thinking of the whole child. We're thinking of that and make sure that they are in a place to get the education instead of struggling with anxiety or depression or other mental health issues. Our schools and educators are wanting greater resources for that, so I support them with it. With a state of over 90 billionaires, I support reforming our regressive tax system so that the wealthiest few are actually paying their fair share, and we're not funding education and our government services on the backs of overly burdened working families. Allowing our neighbors to have access to a good education benefits everyone. I personally believe it would be much more equitable to have more of that education funding coming from the state level rather than locally, because that creates more disparities when you don't pass those levies. So I also support fully funding special education, and I believe that the state, not bonds or local levies, should be doing more to fund that in particular.
Thank you, Ms. Fosse. Mr. Elliott, education funding.
This is one of the areas where I would be the strongest on, because I think we're well past schools and education systems being these obligatory things that children have to march through, parents have to kind of figure out as they go along. I think schools are developmental hubs. There is a mountain of research that supports the impact of a school on a child. And the reason this is important is because children don't stay children. They become adults and they become a larger part of society, and they become police and politicians. And sadly, they also become somebody, who may become homeless. So what we really need to do is say, if this is a developmental hub, what can we do? Why are we worried about levees, falling through for our kids? This should be something that is guaranteed. And I think if we have children who come in, if the families get support, the children are taught in ways that make sense. Common Core is very limiting for a lot of kids, and it doesn't benefit, I would say, the majority of kids in the school district. Why are we using it? If we listen to the teachers and the administrators and anybody else who plays a role in the school, they will all tell you the current system is not working and it's not enough. So we need to stop trying to make these broken pieces work, and we need to come up with something better. And a large part of that will be better funding.
Thank you, sir. Ms. Fosse, let's turn to redistricting. Are there changes you would support to the Washington State redistricting process? If so, what would those be?
So before this last commission, the prior commission, I believe, had all 5 voting members were all white males. And I found that problematic and would probably like to make sure that future commissions are more representative of the population that they're serving. The current system that we have is bipartisan, and as currently designed, does a good job of creating competitive districts, but it seems a little too weighted in protection of incumbents. More voices, I think, are needed to be added to kind of represent residents in more diversity of views and not just maybe the interest of the legislature. I served on the Everett Districting Commission, and public engagement and involvement were of really high value to me. And so I hope the next time at the state level that the maps will be made public prior to final voting. There was some legislation included in the last session, I think, that touched on this. And I was really surprised in the process about the amount of the meeting that was done in privacy. And I think the public was as well. So I'm definitely an advocate for greater transparency in the process, despite, the good process we have in place. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Elliott, your thoughts on the redistricting process?
I will echo a lot of what Ms. Fosse has said. I think it's kind of a clandestine thing. And frankly, I don't think a lot of people understand it. I don't think they understand when changes happen, because I don't think we allow them to understand it. And I don't think people really comprehend the value of those district lines as far as the politicians are concerned. And I don't know that I've ever really talked to anybody who understood it for themselves either. I know that people want to, they want good representative community leaders and politicians. They want good schools, and they want access to this. And a lot of people don't seem to feel that they do, at least not from the conversations that I've had. So I think the purpose of zoning and districting is something that we need to look at before we start making these decisions. But I think they need to be more public. And I think the communities need more of a voice in this. And it could be certain neighborhoods in Everett, it could be certain religious groups in Everett, it could be certain organizations Everett. And I think they all need a larger platform to speak about these issues that end up having a profound impact on them. Thank you.
You're very welcome, Mr. Wiley.
Yeah, and I agree with some of the things that Ms. Foss said. And, the commission as it is set up to preserve and protect those who are being elected in the Republican and Democratic parties. And it's only made up of those two parties. So one of the things we could definitely do is get more third-party representation in there. But more importantly than just the districts, I think it's the way that we have elections and the way that it's done in the districts to exclude the minority vote. I support single transferable voting reform for multi-seat positions, such as state representatives that we're all running for. Single transferable vote allows, instead of having two positions where you pick the top one, so the majority is represented in both seats, they are run together, and you take the top two people who get the votes, so that the majority and the largest minority are both represented within a district. I think that would be one of the best reforms that we could pass to encourage more minority representation throughout all of Washington and make the districts feel less restrictive and unrepresentative.
Thank you, Mr. Wiley. Mr. Elliott, you'll lead off on this question about Roe versus Wade. If the U.S. Supreme Court overturns Roe versus Wade, would you support making any changes to existing state laws regarding access to abortion? If so, what would those be?
Again, I'm confused as to why this is even a conversation in 2022 in our country, let alone anywhere. It is a medical decision, and women's bodies are their rights. So I think that this is something Washington needs to fight very strongly for. I think we need to do anything we can do to strengthen it. So there are probably solutions that we haven't even discussed yet, but I think we need funding for safe clinics and safe options. And if for some reason Washington isn't able to support that, I think we need to find a way that will. Maybe it's partnering with a neighboring state so that there's always an option, because we don't need this becoming more antagonistic to people who are seeking abortions. We don't need unhealthier options made available. So I don't know the decisions that are leading to a possible overturning of that decision. But I do know that we need to stand up and fight with everything we have to protect it. I also think we need to be very frank in saying, if this were a male equivalent, what would the males be saying? And I know a lot of people aren't happy with that, but it's a very valid point of view. So I think unless we challenge the things that have led us to this point, I don't think there will be any significant change. And I hope that people will align with their families to come up with better answers and better approaches to this. Thank you.
You're very welcome, Mr. Wiley. Your thoughts?
Yeah, so if the U.S. Supreme Court kicks this back down to the states, I do not expect much to change in Washington. It'll be a great fundraising point for Democrats and Republicans to once again talk about a non-existent threat and have nothing changed. That's been the case with the abortion debate my entire life. If the debate did become live in Washington state legislature, which I really doubt, I don't think there's any political will on the people or the legislature to significantly change things, and I am not going to push for change. I think that right now it overall works pretty well. The only thing that I might change is a little more clarification of at what point we allow abortion and when the choice becomes chosen, because I believe there's still a little bit of gray area that may worry some. But overall, I don't think much will change, and I don't want this to, as important as this issue is, and people feel very strongly about it on both sides, and I respect that, but we have a lot of work that we need to get done, protecting the economy, fixing the homelessness crisis, fixing problems with our justice system, and I don't want to allow this to become a distraction when there's no real intent to change anything.
Thank you. And Ms. Fosse, your thoughts?
This is not a non-existent threat. I have personally experienced barriers to reproductive care in Washington state. And thank you to Mr. Elliott for your sentiments. I appreciate them. I consider myself a pro-access to the full range of reproductive healthcare services for my community. From contraception to fertility needs to abortion care. I would support making changes to the existing law as long as that we're continuing to strengthen accessibility or the right to access abortion or reproductive care. I know previously we had House Bill 1851, and that was passed last session, and it took incredible care to kind of ensure that all pregnant people in Washington legally were protected in their right to access abortion care, but there's still uneven resources distributed. So again, there's the inequities that persist in communities. Hospital mergers that previously you guys had mentioned do reduce, the ones that do reduce access to reproductive health care are problematic. And I know that there's work being done on this front right now at the legislature, which I would support. And I would also support policies aimed at addressing maternal and infant mortality rates as well, because especially the ones with a focus on addressing the systemic issues, the ones that impact racial disparities and health outcomes. Thank you.
You're welcome. Let's talk climate change. Mr. Wiley, you'll take the lead. What legislation would you support to address the need for local responses to climate change, including through the comprehensive plans for the Growth Management Act?
Again, coming back to the homelessness issue, we have a lot of issues with local pollution that comes to homelessness. I keep hearing about how we're going to clean up the world here in Washington State. And I wonder if any of those people have driven through Seattle lately. We need to reform our cities. We have wonderful green spaces in Washington that the Growth Management Act protects. And, you know, that's a wonderful feature of Washington State. Unfortunately, the oversight when the Growth Management Act was created was assuming that all the cities would do the right thing and allow growth. They have not. And as a result, we have what we have today. And continuing to vote the same old way is not going to fix it. We need to really get our cities on board, fixing the homelessness, cleaning up the streets. That is the first thing, because until we clean up our cities, we cannot lead the way in cleaning up the world.
Thank you, Ms. Fosse.
So we are headed towards a cleaner future, and there's going to be many steps in between, but we need to be thoughtful and intentional along the way in building that kind of low carbon economy that is actually putting people to work. We need pathways, expanded grids, and investments for building clean energy infrastructure. And so I believe if you really want to fix climate change, we need to make it somebody's job, and then we'll have, our labor partners support in our efforts. So we'll have the millions of high quality jobs while also making those bold solutions to climate change. I support the principles of 1099 that was recently in the legislature and providing funding for local governments to develop it. It all comes down to kind of how various aspects of the policy are tackled. With the expansion of renewable fuels to help meet emission goals in stormwater management and water reclamation, these proposals can really kind of have an excellent economic and job opportunities. I would support and champion policies that make our built environments cleaner, and also support our tree canopy expanse. And I know that recently the Snohomish County and Councilmember Megan Dunn had worked to push some really nice policies forward with regards to our tree canopy. And I had led a letter in the Everett City Council to sign on with support to that. Thank you.
You're welcome, Mr. Elliott. Climate change.
So I think this is a really interesting problem that faces us. And I think there's a number of things we can do. And one, and again, studies have shown, if you get children involved, they start doing more throughout their whole life. So if you get them involved in recycling, for example, they're going to be better recyclers than people who weren't taught early. So I think there's opportunity there. And I know that doesn't address the issues now. What we can do about those, we can find maybe sister cities across the world that have done very well in these areas and adapt some of their solutions, because this does create jobs and it does create more opportunities for us. I know there are nations that have used the power of their coast, hydroelectric solutions to create more energy that's very green, that doesn't take any natural resource. It's non-intrusive, it's non-invasive, and again, it creates jobs. I think another really good solution is we have a lot of passionate people in this area. Let's find ways through communicating to connect people's concerns to the health and well-being of their city, So that way they don't just feel pride in their business or their family or the way the city looks, but also their role in helping the city look that way. So I think this is a very personal issue for us to connect with many people, to create jobs, to create funding, and to create opportunities to make a greener future. Thank you.
You're welcome. Let's talk for a moment about violent firearms incidents. Ms. Fosse, please take the lead. What do you believe are the 3 best ideas for reducing the likelihood of violent firearms incidents in our county and state?
So preventing violence in our communities really must be a priority for our elected officials. In Washington State, we have shown that we do not want to be repeating those violent cycles of firearm death and injury. And over the past 2 decades, voters and legislatures have passed several things to protect our neighbors and also hold gun owners to a higher standard of responsibility, including raising the age to purchase and strengthening existing background check laws and creating standards for safe storage. The legislature took a major step this year in limiting the magazine sizes and banning ghost guns. Next, I anticipate what the legislature is probably going to be looking at is access to the military style assault weapons, and then raising the age on gun purchases, and also making major investments into our mental health system, which consistently ranks at the bottom of all the states. Evidence doesn't support that folks with mental illnesses are more likely to commit acts of gun violence or crime, but Washington State, about 70% of our gun deaths are by suicide. And so investments into mental health care and safe storage laws are really, really critical to reduce the rate of firearm fatalities here.
Thank you. Mr. Elliott, your 3 best ideas?
Honestly, I think this is a problem that 3 best ideas won't quite address, because I think we have a very conflicting problem here. People want the right to defend themselves. People don't want their guns to be attacked. And I think that the way the conversation has started is people feel that their guns are being attacked. And I think we need to make it clear this isn't about doing away with the Second Amendment or this inherent right we have as American citizens to defend ourselves. I think what we need to do is really work on the mindset, because we look at violent alternatives when we get to a place where we don't know what else to do or when we're not being heard. And I think, yes, we can strengthen mental health systems, especially when it comes to suicide. And we can work with community partners and we can talk about ages, but I don't think these things are an issue. Age isn't an issue for people to get almost anything they want. You can 3D print guns now, and that's not going to be a thing that is going to matter with age, or it's going to matter with magazine size. We need a much more comprehensive mindset adjustment. So how do we keep our guns and our constitutional rights and say we're going to protect everybody that we can, right? If you want to go to the range, if you want to go hunting, that's fine. But when problems arise, what avenues are there for you to address the problems that may then lead to gun violence, whether it's self or others? Thank you.
Mr. Wiley.
Yeah, this is one place where I strongly disagree with the current mindset that's coming out of Olympia, where they're set to disarm peaceful people in our minority and rural communities, where it may take an hour for an officer to arrive in some places. And in our minority communities, they may not trust the officer who arrives. People need to be able to have the tools to defend themselves. The target really needs to be violence. And as I said, right here in Everett, just a short time ago, we had someone shooting at a school, and within the next day, they're released. We really need a justice system that is serious about violence. We need to stop the catch and release of violent criminals onto our streets. We need to enforce that there are protections for the public against these violent criminals, that they don't so easily post bail, including cash bail reform. We're focused a lot or Olympia is focused a lot on the firearms, but we need to look at the human element. I do agree we need to support mental health for the people. We need to take it as seriously as physical health issues, but the focus really needs to be on justice reform and public.
Thank you, Mr. Wiley. Mr. Elliott, if elected, what ideas do you have for working productively with your staff, colleagues, and members of the public whose ideas are different from yours?
I'm hoping to encounter a lot of that, because if my ideas were the ones that worked, I'd already be up there doing them. If one person was the solution, and recognizing, right, I'm a straight white male, and a lot of people are getting sick of seeing this and hearing this, and I can't help that I'm passionate about the work. So what I want to do is I want to encounter the different perspectives, and I want to say, that's great, thank you for sharing that. How do we implement this? I think the reason that I'm up here is because I have the passion and the ability to work with people, regardless of differences. And if there's somebody who stands in the way of progress or has an agenda that isn't good for the people, I think I have the ability to call that out and stand by that decision and either bring people together for a productive conversation, or say, you know what, you are outdated. Your answers are clearly not working, and we need to allow new voices to be heard. And again, you know, we're not going to agree with everybody. That's part of the beauty of our country, is that we have so many differences, but the ability to make them work together and to bring new perspectives, I think that is a strength. So I'm hoping to find people who differ, so we can say, this one thing isn't enough. Let's create something together that will get this done. Thank you.
You're very welcome, Mr. Wiley. Working productively?
Can you repeat the question?
Of course. If elected, what ideas do you have for working productively with your staff, colleagues, and members of the public whose ideas may be different from yours?
Well, as you know, I'm not a Democrat or Republican. I belong to a minority party. So yes, I've experienced this from both sides. People's ideas will be different from mine. The majority of my area do not identify as libertarian. And all of the people in Olympia right now, none of them are libertarian. None of them represent my ideas. And what we really need, and what I really need to do as a representative, is to listen to everybody, everyone's voice, even those, or especially those who are disagreeing with me, so that they're heard, they're considered, and they're taken into account. And really important thing, it's right there in the first part of our state constitution, is that we are supposed to have a government that governs with consent, right? We need to protect the rights of every individual. That it's not enough that, okay, we have a majority and we can ram something through, but to consider, okay, this person objects, we need to take into consideration their consent and what their rights are, and we need to protect those, especially when we disagree with them.
Thank you. Ms. Fosse?
So I come from a community building and advocacy background. And so I love talking with my neighbors and hearing their concerns and priorities and ideas. And sometimes I encounter perspectives that are different from mine, but I don't believe that conflict has to be bad. I think that diverse opinions and perspectives lead to innovation, or in the least, educational opportunities for us. Mr. Elliott was not wrong earlier when he pointed out politics in Olympia as problematic. I believe that government should help people. And as leaders, we have the opportunity to heal divisions and actually build community. And it's important for us to maintain respectful discourse when we're speaking to each other. But I believe that we can make a lot of progress if we assume positive intentions and look for shared purposes and goals and those, kind of foundational wants. It's our responsibility to work together and create a better quality of life for our neighbors. So, I think that we will do better if we remember we have more in common than that which divides us. As for staff, I have personally fought for my colleagues' right to collectively bargain at the legislature this last session, and I would be interested in reviewing House Bill 2124 so staff are protected from their organizing efforts from things like retaliation prior to 2024. So I don't think I'll have any issues with my staff.
Thank you. Timer, if you'd set the time for 1 minute for this next question. Friends, we've talked about homelessness, hospital mergers, education funding, redistricting, Roe versus Wade, climate change, firearms incidents, and working productively. Starting with Mr. Wiley, take 1 minute and expand a little on any one of those that you didn't feel like you quite finished your thoughts on.
I spent a lot of time on justice and homelessness, and I don't feel that I spent enough time on the third plank of my platform, which is the economy. And that we really need growth, and we need to look at tax reform. Washington State, though it has a Democratic leadership, leads in regressive taxation. And we hear all the time that, oh, we're going to tax the rich and make things better. That's not the same as relieving the burden on the poor. We need tax reform that shifts the burden. We need to put less tax on the poor and needy. We talk about these failing levies and that they raise the price of homes, and we don't make the connection to homelessness and that connection. So let's shift our tax structure to encourage economic growth and have less burden on the poor and needy.
Thank you very much. Ms. Fossey, expand on any of your previous answers.
Sure. I would actually like to reiterate about the economy partially. I believe with Rep. Sell's retirement from the seat, we're going to need more people in Olympia fighting for workers, their rights, their livelihoods, and I really want to be that advocate. I personally know the value of unions and was lifted out of poverty because of the help from one. And I know that if we want a viable economy and an equitable and thriving community, we really must grow and support living wage jobs in this region. We need to support our skilled labor force pipeline and our physical and social infrastructure. And by doing that, along with our port capacity and light rail expansion and essential amenities, we're really going to be an attractive destination for growing industries. I just also want to reemphasize childcare, childcare, childcare. Please, more childcare investments. Thank you.
You're very welcome, Mr. Elliott.
There's always more to be said. So I would like to take a slightly different tack and just say to whoever's watching this, it's an hour, and share it with people and get together and talk, and then challenge the people who are already seated, and then talk to the people running for those seats. We're here to represent you. We obviously are part of the community as well, but we're saying, I want this responsibility. I want you to hold me accountable. So I want to just say to whoever's watching this, you're important, your family's important, your goals are important. So take this time, share this debate with people and say, look, these are what they're saying. Are these the people that we want? Are these the ideas that we want? And if not, let's bring that to them. And I think that if we can do that and have an accountable system, I think we're going to see results on a level that we haven't seen before, hopefully in a way that works for the people that live in that area. Thank you.
You're very welcome. Timer, let's keep the time at 1 minute for this very last question, which is for you, Ms. Fossey, first. Is there anything else, any additional issue or information you'd like to bring to the attention of the community? You'll need to unmute, please.
My apologies there. I suppose what I was explaining prior with the childcare emphasis, I feel that with the pandemic, we have had a massive exodus of workers, and in particular, women were impacted because they often get burdened with the primary care responsibilities. I know personally, we have had that issue in my family with being in a childcare desert. There's no access to childcare and there's no access to affordable childcare. And so it's even more challenging to be able to be going back out into the workforce because the lack of availability makes it very, very challenging to find jobs that will actually cover that kind of expense. I think we need to be making more investments there. And I know there has been some work done at the legislature with regards to supplying that workforce. That is also a deficit that we really, really need to add more of that workforce pipeline and that kind of career trajectory. And I think that that will eventually help us in the future.
Thank you. Mr. Elliott, anything additional?
Kind of following what Ms. Foss is saying, I think we need a very strong post-pandemic plan. And I know we're not entirely through it yet, but sat down with literally hundreds of students and families and heard what the pandemic did. I myself, I've had COVID. I've worked through COVID, face to face with people in the heart of the pandemic. And I know that it took so much from so many people. So I think for Washington to stop and say, this is what we're going to do to help people get back on their feet, to help increase services from childcare to whatever else may need to be done. I think that's one thing we need to focus on and quickly. The other thing is I wanted to mention prison reform. I know I'm almost out of time, but I think we have a lot of opportunities there to get people back into society in a healthy and productive way and to improve all of our lives. Thank you.
You're very welcome. Mr. Wiley, bring it home.
Yeah, there are some great points made by the other two. At this point, I kind of want to turn it back on the voters and the people who are listening and say that, we have a very divided culture across the USA and Washington State and right on here in Everett and Marysville and Tulalip. Not just divided between liberal and conservative, but increasingly divided in the way that we approach COVID-19, public health, and other issues. And that there's been long a mindset of the majority trying to push their way on the minority. And it doesn't have to be that way. We can agree to live and let live and have a voluntary society based on consent. I hope that we can agree to live our own way and not force it on others and live together peacefully with prosperity together.
Thank you, Mr. Wiley. The League appreciates these candidates for joining us and for running for office. Thanks also to the League team who made this event run smoothly. Sean Paddock, contact for the candidates and timer tonight, Karen Crowley, tech support, and backups, Nadine Shanti and Valerie Kelly. A recording of this forum and others will be available on the League of Women Voters of Snohomish County website and YouTube channel. Find links at lwvsnoho.org. We encourage you to explore additional information about these and all other candidates. The Snohomish County voter pamphlet will be mailed to residents starting July 13th. Vote411.org, sponsored by the League of Women Voters, is another good source for nonpartisan voting information. Ballots will be mailed on July 15th. Election day is August 2nd. Please vote. This concludes our candidate forum. Thank you all for joining us. Remember, be a voter.